A police officer was driving through a quiet Montana town when he saw a woman screaming and throwing rocks at a limping German shepherd. But the moment he stepped closer, his heart froze, because the dog's torn collar revealed it was a retired canine. And the woman attacking it was its former owner, the very person who had abandoned and abused it years ago. Why had the dog come back to this place? And what dark secrets was it trying to uncover by returning? What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that every animal deserves a loving home, not loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. The late afternoon sun hung low over Redford, Montana, its pale light filtering through the bare branches of cottonwood trees lining Main Street. A sharp wind pushed along the last scraps of snow from the night before, hissing softly against the weathered siding of old buildings. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, with a chill that bit through even the thickest coat. On the corner of Sycamore and 3rd stood an old two-story house with peeling white paint and a leaning fence. Linda Carver, 48, was planted in front of the gate, shoulders squared, her platinum blonde ponytail whipping in the wind. Tall and wiry, with a face weathered from both Montana winters and years of bitterness, she had the air of someone perpetually on edge. Her neighbors knew her as sharp-tongued, quick to take offense, and unafraid to make her displeasure known, traits hardened after her marriage ended in scandal. Right now, her voice rang out in sharp bursts. "Get out of here! Go on!" Her right arm swung forward, releasing a small rock that clattered just inches from its intended target. That target was a German shepherd large-boned, 6 or 7 years old, with a coat that might once have been a proud blend of sable and black but was now dulled and tangled. His ribs showed faintly beneath his fur, and a subtle limp marred his gait. His left ear stood tall, but the right drooped slightly, a scar splitting the skin at its base. Snow clung stubbornly to the fur on his paws. He stood near the fence, tail low but not tucked, amber eyes fixed on Linda with a mixture of caution and defiance. Around his neck clung a torn leather collar with a scratched brass tag. Whatever was written there was obscured under dirt and scratches, the letters catching the light only in fleeting fragments. A small figure stood a few steps away. Molly Bennett, 8 years old, had curly brown hair spilling from beneath a red knit cap. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and she held her school bag awkwardly against one arm as she reached into it with the other. Molly lived above her family's bakery down the street, and she had a habit of slipping scraps to strays despite her mother's warnings. She pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and crouched slightly. "Here, boy. It's okay," she whispered. The shepherd took one cautious step toward her, ears flicking forward. But before he could close the distance, Linda's voice cracked the air again. "Molly, no!" She marched forward, snatching the sandwich and tossing it into the slush. "Don't feed him. You'll just keep him hanging around here." Molly's eyes welled up, but she said nothing, her gaze dropping to her boots. That was when the dark green Ford Explorer rolled to a stop at the curb. The emblem of the Redford Police Department gleamed faintly on its side. Officer Jake Turner, 35, stepped out, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his build solid from years of training. His brown eyes scanned the scene with the calm focus of someone used to reading trouble before it happened. "Afternoon, Linda. Molly," he said, his voice even. "What's going on?" Linda turned toward him, jabbing a finger at the shepherd. "This stray's been sniffing around my property all week. It's dangerous. You need to get rid of it." Jake's gaze dropped to the dog. His eyes caught on the torn collar, on the way the animal's weight shifted to keep strain off his back right leg. He couldn't quite read the brass tag from here, only catching a flash of worn edges. The shepherd's eyes flicked toward him, locking in a steady, silent stare. There was intelligence there, a kind of guarded understanding Jake had seen before in trained working dogs. "I'll handle it," he said, stepping forward. He crouched slightly, lowering his voice. "Easy, buddy. You're all right." The dog hesitated, then took a tentative step toward him. Linda scoffed. "Be careful, officer. Dogs like that turn mean." Jake didn't answer her. He reached into his jacket, broke a granola bar in half, and held it out. The shepherd sniffed it, then took it gently from his hand. That small act told Jake more than words could. This dog had been around people, had learned trust once. As the dog chewed slowly, Jake glanced back at Linda. "I'll take care of him from here. Molly, head on home." Molly gave a small nod, lingering only long enough to meet the shepherd's gaze before she left. The dog watched her go before stepping closer to Jake, as though sensing he was the safest option left. Jake led him toward the SUV. The shepherd followed, moving with that subtle limp, snowflakes starting to cling to his fur again as the wind picked up. It wasn't until Jake opened the rear hatch and the dog stepped in that he noticed the brass tag glint once more, letters half hidden, waiting for someone to care enough to read them. The heater hummed softly inside the Ford Explorer, misting the cold from the dog's fur as Jake drove away from Sycamore Street. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, catching the shepherd's reflection, sitting low, his head lifted just enough to watch the world blur past. Jake hadn't missed the way the dog had tensed when Linda spoke. It wasn't the kind of reaction you saw from a stray, it was personal, rooted in something older. In his years on the force, Jake had seen the difference between instinctive fear and recognition. This had been recognition. The roads outside Main Street narrowed, lined with bare cottonwoods and snow-patched yards. Jake turned toward a quieter part of town where the noise of traffic faded and the smell of wood smoke grew stronger. He needed to think, and more importantly, he needed to get the dog out of the open. At a red light, he studied the collar again in the mirror. The leather was cracked, edges fraying, the brass tag dented. A faint curve of a letter, maybe an M or a W, was visible beneath the scratches. It wasn't enough to read, but enough to make him suspect this wasn't just some random collar someone had tossed on a stray. The shepherd shifted, his front paws sliding slightly as the SUV turned. When Jake reached for a paper bag on the passenger seat and tore off another piece of granola bar, the dog's ears flicked sharply at the sound of the crinkle like it had registered the noise as a cue. That made Jake pause. He tested it, snapping his fingers twice. The dog's head turned instantly. Not just turned focused. That kind of responsiveness didn't come from the streets. "You've been trained, haven't you?" Jake murmured. He thought of Ranger, his old canine partner, and the long months after losing him. It wasn't just the loss of a dog, it was the end of a partnership built on wordless trust. He'd sworn off working with canines after that, but here he was, talking to one in the back seat as though no time had passed. The light turned green, and he continued toward the station. Snow began to fall again, small flakes swirling in the air. When they arrived, Jake parked in the rear lot, away from the main entrance. The fewer curious eyes, the better. He opened the hatch, and the shepherd hesitated only a second before stepping down. The limp was more pronounced now, and Jake made a mental note to have a vet check it soon. Inside the small auxiliary garage at the station, the warmth wrapped around them immediately. Tom Reynolds, a civilian staffer in his late 50s with a barrel chest and a weathered ball cap, looked up from sorting equipment. He was the kind of man who spoke little, but noticed everything. "That yours?" Tom asked, nodding toward the dog. "Not exactly," Jake replied. "Picked him up near Sycamore. Looks like he's been through a lot." Tom's gaze softened as the shepherd sniffed cautiously at a stack of boxes. "Seen a lot of dogs, but not many with eyes like that. He's been trained. Bet my paycheck on it." Jake gave a slight smile. "Yeah, I'm starting to think so too." As the shepherd explored, Jake crouched again, offering a hand. The dog came over, pressing his nose briefly against Jake's palm before sitting down at his side. It was a gesture Jake recognized, not dominance, not submission, but choice. "All right, buddy," he said quietly. "Let's figure out who you are." The next morning in Redford dawned under a pale, wintry light, the sky a sheet of cold silver that promised more snow before nightfall. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hiss of tires on slush, and the scent of wood smoke hung low in the air. Jake Turner sat at his desk in the modest corner office of the Redford Police Department, the steady hum of the old radiator filling the silence. Across the desk, a half-empty coffee mug steamed faintly beside a manila folder marked Carver, Linda, 2016. Jake leaned back in his chair, scanning the printed reports inside. The records were blunt. In 2016, Linda Carver had been investigated for animal cruelty after a neighbor reported repeated sounds of distress from her backyard. The case had been dismissed before charges were filed, the official note citing lack of conclusive evidence. But as Jake read further, it became clear why Linda's husband at the time, Mark Carver, had been a sitting member of the Redford Town Council, with enough influence to keep trouble at bay. The statements from witnesses told another story entirely. One report described a German shepherd with a deep laceration on its hind leg, left untreated for days. Another noted that the same dog had vanished shortly afterward. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Shadow's limp, the scar on his ear, the way he froze at the sound of Linda's voice. The office door creaked open and Officer Dana Hughes stepped in, balancing a clipboard under one arm. Dana, in her early 40s, had close-cropped auburn hair and a practical, no-nonsense air about her. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried herself like someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by small-town politics. Her eyes flicked to the file on Jake's desk. "You're digging into Carver?" Jake gave a short nod. "Looks like she's got history, and I think our shepherd might be tied to it." Dana's brow furrowed. "Wouldn't surprise me. That woman's been a thorn in everyone's side for years. You think this connects to your theft case?" "I'm starting to," Jake replied, closing the folder. "The theft ring I've been tracking, some of the stolen goods are showing up around Sycamore Street. And guess whose property sits right on the corner?" Dana let out a low whistle. "You're saying she's involved?" "I'm saying I need to find out." Later that afternoon, Jake decided to follow Shadow's lead. The shepherd had spent the morning resting in the auxiliary garage, lying on an old blanket with his injured leg tucked in. When Jake stepped in, Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking. "Come on, buddy," Jake said, clipping a lead to the frayed collar. "Let's take a walk." They set out toward the west side of town, the snow crunching beneath Jake's boots. The air was cold enough to sting, but Shadow moved with surprising determination, nose low to the ground as he sniffed the air. His pace quickened as they approached the older part of Redford, where abandoned houses sat slouched and shuttered, their paint peeling in the frost. Shadow stopped suddenly at the edge of a sagging chain-link fence. Beyond it stood a weather-beaten house, its windows boarded and roof sagging under the weight of snow. Jake recognized it from the property records. It had been unoccupied for over a year. Shadow's tail stiffened, his body angled toward the backyard. Jake found a gap in the fence and stepped through, Shadow following close. The snow here was deeper, crunching loudly underfoot as they rounded the corner of the house. That's when Jake saw it, a shallow pit, half filled with wind-blown snow and brittle weeds. Inside lay a rusted length of chain, one end looped through a broken stake and the other dangling loose. The chain was crusted with something dark, long dried. Jake crouched, brushing away snow with his gloved hand. Beneath the chain, faint reddish-brown stains clung to the frozen earth-old blood. He didn't need forensics to tell him it matched the story in the witness reports. Shadow stood beside him, head low, staring into the pit. He didn't whine or bark, but there was a weight in his stance, a recognition of the place. Jake reached out, resting a hand on the shepherd's shoulder. "This is where she kept you, isn't it?" he murmured. From the corner of his eye, Jake spotted movement, a figure standing on the far side of the fence, partially obscured by a bare lilac bush. It was Paul Henson, a thin, stooped man in his late 60s with watery blue eyes and a face creased deep from years of outdoor work. He lived 2 houses down and had a reputation for knowing everyone's business. "Officer Turner," Paul called quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if wary of being seen. "I remember that dog. She used to keep him chained out here, bad winters too. He was hurt once, real bad, but she never took him to the vet. Then one day, he was just gone." Jake stepped closer. "Did you ever see her mistreat him?" Paul's jaw worked as he chewed on the question. "More than once. I told the council back then, but her husband shut it down. Folks stopped talking about it after that." Jake nodded slowly, piecing the history together. Shadow had been injured in a break-in, left untreated, and then discarded. And now, Linda's name was coming up alongside stolen goods moving through the West Side. It was too much to ignore. As they left the property, Shadow's head turned once more toward the pit before Jake led him away. The snow began to fall in earnest, soft flakes settling on the shepherd's fur. Jake felt the weight of what he'd seen settling in his chest, not just the cruelty, but the injustice of it being buried for years. Back at the station, Jake typed up his notes, adding Paul Henson's statement to the file. He also logged the location of the abandoned house and the evidence found there. His theft investigation was taking on a darker shape now, one that tied directly back to Linda Carver. As Shadow lay curled on the blanket beside his desk, Jake glanced down at him. "You've been through hell," he said quietly, "but you're not alone anymore." The snow had stopped by mid-morning, leaving a thin, crystalline crust over Redford's streets that crunched under every step. Jake pulled his Ford Explorer into the parking lot of Pine Hollow Veterinary Clinic, a small but well-kept building at the edge of town. Its cedar siding and green trim gave it a welcoming look, and the faint smell of pine cleaner drifted from the glass doors every time they opened. In the back seat, Shadow sat quietly, his amber eyes watching the movement outside. Jake had spent enough years around dogs to know that quiet didn't always mean calm. Shadow's tail lay still, his ears flicking at the smallest sound. Jake leaned into the back, speaking in a steady voice. "All right, buddy, let's get you checked out." Inside, the clinic lobby was warm and filled with the soft background noise of a radio playing old country songs. The air carried a mix of antiseptic and the sweet scent of hay from the small animal boarding room. A stack of neatly folded blankets sat in one corner beside a water cooler, and framed photographs of recovered animals lined the walls. Behind the reception counter stood Dr. Karen Whitfield, a veterinarian in her late 50s with short, silver-streaked hair and clear blue eyes. She wore a maroon scrub top under a soft gray cardigan, her hands moving with quiet precision as she organized a stack of files. Karen was known in town for her calm, patient manner and an ability to put even the most nervous animals at ease, a skill honed during years working at a busy animal rescue before she moved to Redford. "Well, if it isn't Officer Turner," Karen greeted warmly, her gaze drifting down to Shadow. "And who's this?" "Found him near Sycamore. He's been through a lot," Jake replied. Karen's expression softened as she stepped around the counter. She crouched a few feet away from Shadow, letting him take in her scent before reaching out. "Hey, handsome," she murmured. Shadow sniffed her hand, then allowed her to gently scratch behind his ear. They moved into the examination room, its tile floor warmed by a heating mat under the table. Karen worked slowly, speaking in a calm tone as she checked Shadow's eyes, teeth, and coat. When she examined his hind leg, she paused, her brow furrowing. "These scars, they're old, but they match the pattern of untreated lacerations. And here," she pointed to a faint line along his rib cage, "that's from a cracked rib, probably years back. All healed, but without proper alignment." Jake's jaw tightened. Could that match the kind of injuries in a cruelty case? Karen nodded gravely. "It could. If I had to guess, he's been through repeated trauma over a span of years. The good news is he's not in immediate pain, just some stiffness from the old injuries. But," she glanced up, her voice firm, "he's resilient. That says a lot about him." While Karen finished her notes, the door to the exam room cracked open and two children peeked in. A boy and girl, no more than 6 and 8, with winter coats half-zipped. Their mother, Sarah Reed, followed close behind. Sarah was in her early 40s, with chestnut-brown hair pulled into a neat bun and a face lined with kindness. She worked part-time at the local library and was known for checking in on neighbors without being asked. "Sorry, Doc," Sarah said, ushering the kids back gently. They saw the dog through the window. She looked at Jake. "Officer Turner. I'm Mrs. Reed. We live near Linda Carver." Jake straightened slightly. "I've heard your name." Sarah hesitated before speaking, her voice low. "I've seen her hit that dog, more than once, and at night you could hear him, crying. My kids used to wake up scared from it." Her expression tightened. "I told people, but no one wanted to get involved." Jake gave a slow nod. "Thank you for telling me. That means more than you know." While the adults spoke, Karen let the children approach. Shadow stood calmly, sniffing their mittens before sitting down, his posture relaxed. The boy giggled when Shadow's nose brushed his hand and the girl leaned in to hug the dog's neck. For an animal supposedly dangerous, he showed nothing but gentle patience. "Looks like he's making friends," Karen said with a smile. "I'll print out the medical notes for your file, Jake. In the meantime, he's healthy enough to stay with you if you're up for it." Jake glanced down at Shadow, who was watching the children leave, tail giving the faintest wag. "Yeah," Jake said quietly. "I think we'll be all right." Karen handed him a folder with the examination results. "Keep him warm, feed him well, and let him rest that leg. If you notice any swelling or change in gait, bring him back." On the drive back toward the station, Shadow lay in the back, his eyes half closed. The late afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows over the snow. Jake felt the quiet weight of responsibility settling over him, not just as an officer, but as the only person standing between Shadow and the world that had failed him before. By the time they reached the garage, Jake had made up his mind. Until he figured out what Linda Carver was hiding, Shadow wasn't going anywhere. The sky over Redford had turned the deep steel blue of a winter evening, the kind that seemed to press down on the town and swallow sound. Street lamps glowed pale yellow against the frost, and the snow on the rooftops reflected the cold light of the moon. Jake Turner sat in the front seat of his Ford Explorer parked 2 streets over from Sycamore, his breath faint in the chill inside the cab. On the passenger seat lay a small duffel bag inside, 2 compact surveillance cameras, extra batteries, and a set of wireless transmitters. Earlier that day, he had looped in Officer Matt Kincaid, his closest colleague and a man Jake trusted without question. Matt, in his late 30s with sandy blonde hair and a lean, wiry build, had the quick reflexes of someone who had grown up working ranches but the patient, calculated manner of an experienced investigator. The two had worked narcotics stings before, but this was different. It wasn't just about stolen goods. It was about Shadow, and the pieces of his past tied directly to Linda Carver. "You think she's sloppy enough to hide product on her own property?" Matt asked, pulling his gloves tighter. Jake's gaze was fixed on the street corner where Linda's house sat, its porch light casting a narrow wedge of yellow across the snow. "Sloppy? No. Arrogant? Absolutely." By the time the sun had set, they had planted 2 small cameras, one tucked into the hollow of a leaning fence post near the back of Linda's property, the other hidden inside an unused birdhouse mounted high on a neighbor's shed. Both offered a clear view of the small, weathered storage shed that sat at the back of Linda's lot. Jake had brought Shadow along for the stakeout, and the dog now lay curled in the back of the SUV, his head resting on his front paws. His ears twitched occasionally at passing noises, but otherwise he was still, his amber eyes half closed. The first 2 hours passed quietly. A light snow began to fall, dusting the windshield. Jake and Matt took turns sipping coffee from a thermos. Then, just after midnight, Shadow's head snapped up. His ears pricked, and a low, warning rumble rose in his throat. Jake glanced at him, instantly alert. "What is it, boy?" Shadow rose to his feet, paws pressing against the rear door, eyes fixed on the narrow gap between 2 houses across the street. Jake followed his gaze and caught the shape of a man slipping along the fence line toward the back of Linda's property. The figure moved with practiced stealth, dressed in dark clothing, his hood pulled low. Matt was already moving, checking the sidearm at his hip. "We've got movement." They exited the vehicle silently, sticking to the shadows. Shadow padded alongside Jake, his paws barely making a sound in the snow. As they approached the back of the property, they saw the man unlatch the shed door and disappear inside. From their angle, Jake caught the faint metallic glint of something stacked inside crates, unmarked but uniform. Jake gestured for Matt to circle wide to cover the other side. He and Shadow moved closer, sticking to the blind spot along the fence. Through the cracked door of the shed, Jake heard the muffled clink of glass jars and the shuffle of cardboard boxes. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Jake froze, his hand on Shadow's lead. The man inside must have sensed something. Footsteps thudded toward the door. When the figure emerged, he came fast, swinging a length of metal pipe. Jake barely had time to register the motion before Shadow lunged forward, barking sharply. The sound shattered the stillness, startling the man mid-swing. The pipe glanced off Jake's raised forearm instead of his head, the blow jarring but not crippling. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Jake twisted the man's wrist, sending the pipe clattering to the snow. Shadow stood his ground between Jake and the intruder, teeth bared but not biting, the deep growl in his chest keeping the man frozen in place. Matt rounded the corner then, weapon drawn. "Hands where I can see them!" The intruder complied, muttering under his breath. They cuffed him quickly and moved to secure the shed. Inside, the smell of motor oil and old wood was heavy in the air. Along one wall, cardboard boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling, each stamped with a faint warehouse code. Jake slit one open. With his pocket knife inside were dozens of high-end food products, the kind reported stolen from delivery trucks over the past month. "Well, we found the stash," Matt muttered, shining his light over the rows of boxes. Jake's attention drifted to a canvas duffel in the corner, partially unzipped. He knelt, pulling it open. Inside were several smaller items, a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a leather lead not unlike those used in K-9 units. The metal clasp on the lead was engraved with a number, barely visible under scratches. He filed it away in his mind. They photographed everything before calling it in. While Matt dealt with transporting the suspect, Jake walked Shadow back toward the SUV. The dog moved calmly beside him, tail level, but Jake knew that without Shadow's warning bark, the blow from that pipe could have been far worse. Back in the vehicle, Jake reached back to ruffle the fur between Shadow's ears. "You did good tonight," he said quietly. "Real good." Shadow's eyes softened, and he gave a slow blink, settling back onto the blanket as if the tension of the last hour had drained away. The snow was falling heavier now, erasing their footprints as they pulled away from the curb. Behind them, the flashing lights of arriving patrol cars painted the street in red and blue. Jake knew they had evidence tying the shed and its contents to Linda Carver. It was just a matter of time before the walls closed in. By the time Jake arrived at the Redford Community Center, the evening sky had gone indigo, and the glow from the building's tall front windows spilled onto the snow-packed parking lot. The center itself was a broad, brick structure built in the 1960s, its wooden double doors worn smooth by decades of meetings, dances, and town votes. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of coffee from a folding table near the back and the faint scent of old varnish from the gymnasium floor where chairs had been set in neat rows. Jake walked in with Shadow at his side, the German shepherd moving calmly, his tail low and ears alert. The crowd's murmurs softened as people noticed them. Shadow's sable coat gleamed under the overhead lights, his amber eyes scanning the room but never leaving Jake's lead. To many in the room, this was their first time seeing the dog they'd only heard about in whispers and rumors. Near the front row, Ellen Marks, the community center coordinator, adjusted the microphone on its stand. Ellen was a woman in her early 60s with cropped silver hair, round glasses, and a voice that could command silence without ever needing to raise in volume. She had the diplomatic patience of someone who had spent her life keeping tempers from boiling over at town meetings. To the left of the makeshift stage stood a cluster of people from the local press. Among them was Darren Cole, a reporter from the Redford Gazette. Darren was in his late 20s, lean, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a camera slung over one shoulder. Known for chasing stories others ignored, he had an instinct for sensing when an event might blow up into something bigger. He was already adjusting his lens toward Shadow and Jake. Linda Carver was not yet in sight, but Jake could hear her voice from the hallway beyond the entrance, sharp, impatient, just loud enough to carry. A minute later, she entered, wearing a fitted navy coat with a fur-trimmed collar, her blonde hair perfectly styled. Her chin was lifted and her stride was quick, as if she intended to get this over with and go home. Several people turned away from her. Others exchanged glances. Jake waited until she had taken a seat near the front before stepping forward. Ellen gestured for him to approach the microphone. "Officer Turner, you asked for time to present evidence," she said, then stepped aside. Jake's voice was steady as he began. "What I'm about to show you is part of an ongoing investigation into property theft in Redford. It also concerns the welfare of animals in our community." He nodded toward a laptop connected to the projector. The screen behind him flickered to life, showing grainy but clear footage from one of the hidden cameras he and Matt had placed. The first clip showed the shed behind Linda's property. A man entered, handling boxes later confirmed as stolen goods. The second clip froze the room. Linda herself stepping into frame in daylight, holding a broom, swinging it toward Shadow as he stood just inside the fence line. The dog flinched, backing away before bolting from view. Gasps rippled through the audience. Linda's face tightened, but she didn't speak. "This is not rumor. This is not hearsay," Jake continued. "This is documented evidence, and I have multiple witness statements confirming that this dog now in my care was kept in inhumane conditions on Linda Carver's property, injured and abandoned." From the back, a voice called, "I saw it too," and several heads turned toward Mrs. Reed, seated beside her 2 children. Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes were clear. "We heard him cry at night, more than once." Darren Cole's camera clicked rapidly, capturing Shadow as he sat at Jake's side, still calm, a living counterpoint to Linda's claim of danger. The dog's presence was magnetic. His posture was steady, but his eyes carried the quiet gravity of someone who had endured more than the room could see. Jake paused, letting the silence stretch. "This isn't only about one dog. It's about how we treat the most vulnerable in our town and whether we allow people with influence to think they're above the law." Linda finally stood, her voice cutting through the air. "This is a smear campaign. That animal was aggressive. I was protecting myself." Jake didn't raise his voice, but his reply was sharp. "That animal sat in a room full of strangers tonight without a single sign of aggression. The only thing he's guilty of is surviving." Ellen Marks stepped forward before the exchange could escalate. "We've heard enough. The evidence speaks for itself." Darren kept filming as murmurs swelled into low conversation across the gym. Some people nodded in agreement. Others leaned toward each other, whispering. The tension in the room had shifted. Linda's control over the narrative was slipping. By the end of the meeting, the town council voted unanimously to forward the evidence to county authorities. Darren caught one last photo of Shadow beside Jake, the dog's gaze steady and calm under the overhead lights. The next morning, the Redford Gazette hit the stands with that photo on the front page. "Justice for Shadow. Evidence brings cruelty and theft to light." The snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes the morning Linda Carver was led out of her house in handcuffs. Redford's narrow streets were lined with parked cars and quiet onlookers, their breath steaming in the cold air as they watched the scene unfold. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers idled at the curb, lights flashing against the white backdrop. Linda, her hair still immaculate but her face pale, kept her chin lifted as if defiance could erase the cameras clicking in rapid bursts. Behind her, Deputy Carla Jensen, a tall, broad-shouldered woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense braid, read out the list of charges. Carla's voice carried easily over the murmurs. Animal cruelty, possession of stolen property, conspiracy to commit theft, and obstruction of justice. The last words hung in the air like a final gavel strike. Jake stood a few yards away, Shadow sitting calmly at his side. The German Shepherd's gaze was fixed on Linda, not aggressive but steady, almost as if he understood the significance of the moment. Snow clung to the sable fur along his back, but he didn't shake it off. He stayed still until Linda was guided into the back of the cruiser. Across town, arrests were happening in tandem. Matt Kincaid, along with 2 other officers, was overseeing the takedown of the theft ring's storage unit on the east side. The suspects, 3 men in their late 20s to early 40s, were known faces from Jake's earlier investigations. The leader, Ronnie Blake, a stocky man with a shaved head and a tattoo curling up his neck, had built a reputation for moving stolen goods through rural towns. Today, his luck had run out. By noon, the evidence room at the Redford Police Department was overflowing stacked boxes of recovered merchandise, ledgers linking Linda's property to the theft ring, and digital files of recorded conversations implicating her directly. The county prosecutor, Angela Price, arrived shortly after to review the case. Angela was in her early 50s, with silver blonde hair cut into a precise bob and a sharp, deliberate way of speaking that left little room for doubt. She had a reputation for being relentless in court, the kind of lawyer who could dismantle a defense with a single line of questioning. "This is solid work," she told Jake, flipping through a binder of statements. "With this level of documentation, I can push for maximum sentencing on the animal cruelty charges and secure a permanent ban on her owning animals again." She glanced down at Shadow, who was stretched out on the floor beside Jake's desk, head resting on his paws. "He's lucky you found him." Jake shook his head slightly. "I think I'm the lucky one." The court proceedings moved faster than Jake expected. Linda's prior influence in town had eroded completely after the community meeting and the media coverage. At the arraignment, her attorney tried to argue for bail, but Angela presented the volume of evidence tying her to the theft operation, along with multiple witness statements about Shadow's treatment. Bail was denied. On the day of sentencing, the courthouse was nearly full. Residents who had followed the story sat shoulder to shoulder, their winter coats draped over their laps. Darren Cole from the Redford Gazette was there again, his camera ready. When the judge read the sentence, 3 years for the theft charges, an additional year for obstruction, and the permanent prohibition on owning or caring for animals, there was no applause, but the collective exhale in the room was almost audible. Shadow wasn't in the courtroom, but Jake felt his presence all the same. In the weeks since the arrests, the dog had settled into Jake's home with an ease that surprised him. The limp was still there, but softer now, and Shadow had claimed a spot by the front window where he would watch the street for hours. That evening, after the sentencing, Jake stood in his small living room, a folder of adoption papers in hand. The ink was still fresh where he'd signed his name, officially transferring Shadow into his care. The dog sat a few feet away, tilting his head at the sound of Jake's voice. "Well, partner," Jake said, crouching to scratch behind Shadow's ear. "Looks like you're stuck with me now." Shadow's tail thumped twice against the rug, and for the first time Jake caught a glimpse of something more than calm watchfulness in those amber eyes, something that looked a lot like peace. The winter in Redford softened gradually, the biting winds giving way to crisp mornings scented with thawing earth and the first hints of pine sap. At the edge of town, Jake Turner's small, cedar-sided home sat near the tree line where the forest began. From his front porch, you could hear the steady rustle of branches in the breeze and the distant call of crows. Shadow had claimed the porch as one of his favorite places. In the mornings, he would stretch out along the planks, nose lifted to catch every scent drifting from the woods. His sable coat had regained its healthy sheen, and the old limp in his back leg was less pronounced now, thanks to weeks of care and exercise. At 6 or 7 years old, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of an animal who knew he was home for good. Jake's days were split between patrol shifts, community events, and making time for Shadow's new routines. They often visited the town's main park, a broad green space with a winding walking path and a small playground. It was here, one Saturday morning, that Jake unveiled a wooden sign he had crafted himself. The letters were burned deep into the grain. Pet-friendly zone. Thanks to Shadow. A small crowd had gathered for the occasion, families with children, a few retirees who walked their dogs daily, and even Sarah Reed with her 2 kids. Sarah, as always, was neatly dressed in a wool coat and scarf, her hair pinned up. She spoke warmly to everyone, pausing to let her children crouch and greet Shadow, who wagged his tail in slow, steady sweeps. Nearby, Mayor Bill Harper, a short, balding man in his late 50s with an easy smile, clapped Jake on the back. "Never thought we'd see the day this park had a dog-friendly area," he said. "Guess it took a certain 4-legged officer to make it happen." The weeks after Linda Carver's sentencing had been good for the town. The tension that once lingered in the air had lifted. replaced by something more open. People began to approach Shadow without hesitation. Children in the neighborhood would call out his name when Jake walked him down Main Street, and the shepherd would respond with a gentle wag, or, if he was feeling playful, a slow trot toward them. One afternoon, the Redford Gazette ran a follow-up piece on the case, focusing not on the crimes, but on what had changed since. Darren Cole's photograph from the community center Jake standing with Shadow at his side was printed again, but this time next to a new image. Jake and Shadow standing in front of the police station, each wearing a medal from the town's annual Community Protectors ceremony. Inside the station, that photo was framed and hung in the main hallway. Officers passing by would often give a nod to it, some jokingly telling Shadow he looked official. The shepherd seemed to take it in stride, as if aware that the building was as much his territory as it was Jake's. Shadow's role in the community went beyond being a symbol. Jake began bringing him to local school visits, where children learned about safety, kindness toward animals, and the responsibilities of pet ownership. Shadow would sit patiently as small hands patted his fur, his calm demeanor doing more to teach empathy than any lecture could. On one of those school visits, Jake noticed a boy lingering at the back of the group. He was thin, with a worn backpack and a guarded expression. While the other children crowded around Shadow, the boy hung back. Jake guided Shadow toward him. "Want to say hi?" The boy hesitated, then reached out. Shadow didn't rush him, just stood still until the boy's hand rested gently on his head. The boy's shoulders loosened, and a small smile appeared. It was a simple moment, but Jake filed it away as proof Shadow was still doing the kind of work that mattered, even if it wasn't chasing suspects anymore. By late spring, the park's pet-friendly area had become a fixture. On warm days, Shadow would lie in the grass near the sign Jake had made, watching as dogs chased balls and children ran between picnic blankets. His amber eyes followed everyone, alert but relaxed, the look of someone who belonged. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the forest shadows stretched long across the yard, Jake sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his paws. From this spot, Jake could see the lights of the town flicker on one by one, the streets calm, the air still. "You've come a long way," Jake said quietly, reaching to scratch behind Shadow's ear, "from that cold street to here." Shadow's ear twitched and his tail gave a slow wag. In the stillness, Jake realized it wasn't just the dog's life that had changed, it was the town's and his own. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunderclaps or flashes of light. They arrive quietly, in the form of a wounded soul given a second chance, like Shadow. In his journey from pain and abandonment to trust and belonging, we see a reflection of God's love for us, a love that rescues, heals, and restores what the world has broken. In everyday life, we all meet shadows, people or creatures who carry unseen scars, and we have the choice to turn away or to be the hands and feet of that same divine love. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may believe that kindness still changes lives. Leave a comment to tell your story. Subscribe to join this community of hope, and may God bless every one of you who chooses compassion. If you believe in second chances, type Amen in Badekrai comment.
That's enough, Lena. It's been 5 damn years. You need to stop waiting for a ghost. The voice cracked like dry wood in the kitchen air, echoing off the cold tiles and untouched coffee cups. Lena didn't flinch. She just stared at the front door same as she did every night. Her hand was still resting on the leash hook by the coat rack. The leash was gone. It had been gone for years. Her brother Imran paced behind her, shoes scuffing the floor with irritation. He'd flown in from Toronto for her birthday, or so he claimed. But all he'd done was toss out expired dog treats and try to pry the past from her like it was some infected splinter. Lena didn't argue, didn't move, because she'd heard it again last night. Not clearly, just a sound barely there. But it was his sound. The soft, gravelly exhale her dog used to make when he circled his bed 3 times before lying down, only she hadn't kept his bed, hadn't even kept his collar. After the 3rd month of searching and crying and putting up posters in the rain, she'd burned it all. Just walked to the field behind her house, lit a match, and watched it turn to smoke. It had felt like betrayal, but also mercy. And yet now, 5 years later, she could swear something was breathing again in that corner. Something that still remembered where it used to rest. Imran muttered curses under his breath and grabbed his jacket. Stay up waiting if you want. I'm done playing along with this haunted fairy tale. He left the house like a gust, slamming the door to hard, jarring the old wood frame. Silence returned like fog. Lena stepped to the window. Her breath fogged the glass slightly. Beyond the pale orange streetlights, the wood stretched in shadow, the trees swaying with something more than wind. She wasn't crazy. She knew what grief could do, how it could twist a scent into a memory, or a shadow into a tale. But she also knew what love sounded like. And last night, she'd heard it scratching gently at the back door, not urgently, not wild, just waiting. She didn't open it, not because she was afraid, but because deep down, something about it wasn't right. Lena made tea at midnight, the kind her dog Barfi used to nuzzle her for chamomile and cardamom. He used to sit quietly at her feet when she'd curl up on the couch, never barking, never begging, just there. The kettle clicked off. She poured the tea and carried it with both hands to the old wooden swing on the porch. The night air smelled like pine needles and memories. As she rocked, her eyes drifted to the edge of the trees. That's when she saw a shape, pale, still not a deer, not a shadow. Something that was waiting just outside the reach of the porch light. She stood slowly. Her heart didn't race, it just steadied. The shape moved. A low, deliberate step forward. Her breath caught. It was a dog. It was him, the head tilt, the uneven front paw, the way he looked directly at her with eyes she had kissed 1,000 times, but his fit was too white, too perfect. Not matted, not aged, not worn by time or hunger. And those eyes, they were Barfi's shape, yes, but not his color. No longer the soft hazel brown she used to read like a book. These were an unnatural gray, clouded, not by age but by something else, something distant. The dog sat at the edge of the porch steps, didn't bark, didn't wag, just waited. Lena whispered, barely breathing, "Barfi." The dog didn't move, but its ears flicked, ever so slightly. At the name, her legs moved before her mind could decide. She knelt at the top of the steps, tears already slipping down her cheeks, mixing with the mist in the air. "Is it you?" she asked. "Are you real?" Still, the dog sat. Then, without warning, it rose graceful and measured and stepped, one paw onto the porch. The wood groaned slightly beneath it, as if adjusting to something heavier than flesh. And that's when Lena noticed it. The paw print it left behind wasn't a print at all. It was dry, bone dry. No mud, no moisture, just a faint blackened mark, as if the wood had been scorched. And then the wind changed, and with it came a whisper. Not heard with ears but felt behind the chestbone. "Not everything that returns is meant to stay." Lena stood frozen, halfway between longing and dread, as the dog she once loved tilted its head once more. And in that moment, she didn't know which she feared more, that it wasn't Barfi or that it somehow was. The porch light flickered once, an old bulb, perhaps, but in that moment, Lena's skin prickled like ice had been poured down her spine. The dog stood silently at the top step now, its gray eyes fixed on her, unblinking, unreadable. Its body was familiar, painfully so, and yet it moved with an eerie precision, as if every motion had been rehearsed in some place where time bent sideways. The scorched paw print remained behind it like a forgotten warning, and Lena didn't know what to trust more, her longing or her instinct. She stepped backward into the house, not in fear but in need of breath. The air inside was thicker, heavier now. She couldn't tell if it was her nerves or the presence of something unseen following close behind. She didn't close the door. She just left it open and watched as the dog remained still, its figure casting no proper shadow beneath the porch light. It wasn't until she whispered the name again, Barfi, that it stepped forward once more, crossing the threshold into her home as if it never left. Inside, everything was silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator had ceased, as if the entire house held its breath. The dog walked with slow, deliberate steps across the wooden floor. No claws clicking, no panting, no tail wagging, just the rhythm of a presence returning, one footfall at a time. Lena's eyes followed the creature to the living room, where it stopped at the corner it used to sleep in. The rug there had changed, years ago, but the dog sat like it remembered everything. Same angle, same posture, as if it had picked up exactly where it left off. She didn't speak. She couldn't. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear but from the echo of years spent holding on to fragments. And now, the very thing she had burned from memory sat living in her home once more, but twisted, altered. Something had followed Barfi back, or worse, something had sent him. It was close to 3 in the morning when Imran returned. The door was still open, the lights dim. He cursed as he entered, slamming it shut behind him. "Lena, what the hell? Why is the door?" He stopped, his voice caught in his throat. The dog turned its head toward him, slow and even, and that stare it pinned him like a nail to a wall. Imran stepped back immediately. No, that can't be him." Lena didn't answer. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, beside the dog, her hand mere inches from its coat, but never touching it. "It looks like him," she whispered. "It knows his name. It came to the porch, but it's not the same." Imran circled the room slowly, keeping his eyes on the animal. "That's not just age," he said. "There's something wrong with it." Dog blinked slowly and lowered its head, not in aggression, but in something like grief. Then it stood, walked to the center of the living room, and sat again directly beneath the ceiling fan. And then, without warning, it howled. The sound was not a bark, nor the playful yelp she remembered. It was a low, trembling wail that carried too much weight for one throat. It seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the room, reverberating in the walls, leaking into the floorboards like water in a flood. For several seconds, time forgot how to move. When the howl ended, a photo frame on the mantel slipped and fell. Not shattered, just tipped, landing on its face. Lena picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a photo from before Buffy disappeared. Her, kneeling in the park, arms around him, his eyes full of joy and mischief. But now, in this room, there was no joy, no mischief, only memory, and something deeper, pressing beneath it, something that didn't belong. Imran whispered, "Lena, I think something came through with him." She didn't answer, but she stood and walked slowly to the dog. Her voice was softer now. "Where have you been?" she asked. "What brought you back?" The dog blinked again. Then, in a movement, almost too smooth to be natural, it turned and padded toward the hallway. It stopped once, glancing back, and continued. Lena followed. Down the hallway it went, past the bathroom, past the linen closet, and finally to the guest bedroom, the room that had remained shut since her father died 4 years ago. She hadn't entered it since the funeral. The doorknob was untouched, layers of dust hugging its bronze edges. Yet the dog waited patiently, seated before it. Imran had followed silently, his face pale. "Don't open that," he said. Lena stared at the door. Her hand trembled as she reached out and twisted the knob. The door creaked open. The air inside was still and stale, but not cold. The dog walked inside and sat in the center of the room, looking directly at the far wall. Stepped in, blinking through the gloom, and there it was. On the wall, scrawled faintly in charcoal, was a marker shape that hadn't been there before. Circular, ancient, like some forgotten sigil etched in haste. She stepped closer. The lines pulsed slightly like breath beneath. It, carved into the paint, was a word. Return. Her knees nearly gave. She turned to the dog. "You didn't find your way back," she whispered. "You were sent." The creature stared at her, unmoving. And then, for the first time since it arrived, it stood and walked to her side. It leaned in gently, pressing its forehead to her knee. The gesture was unmistakable. That was Buffy, or what was left of him. But the message was clear. He hadn't returned to stay. He'd come back because something had unfinished business, something that used his body, his memory, to reach her. And the question now wasn't whether he would stay. It was what came next. For a moment, neither of them moved. The dog, if it was truly a dog, stood at the top step, eyes fixed on her with impossible calm. The porch light flickered once, casting a trembling shadow across the siding. Lena didn't blink. Her breath had gone shallow, caught somewhere between fear and yearning. Everything in her wanted to reach out to call his name again, to fall into the comfort of old memory, but her body knew something her mind was refusing to admit. This wasn't reunion. This was something else entirely. The dog stepped further onto the porch, its paws silent despite the dry wooden planks. The air grew colder as it moved, not with wind, but with presence. Lena backed into the doorframe. The closer it came, the more she could feel it, a wrongness just beneath the surface. It looked like Buffy moved like him, even the way it sat slightly to one side, weight favoring the right hip. That was him. But Buffy had never made it there feel like it had forgotten how to breathe. Then it did something that shattered her composure completely. It sat in front of her, slowly, and rested its head against her knee exactly like it used to during thunder, during heartbreak, during every quiet storm of her life. She gasped softly, unable to stop the tears that rose. The softness of the gesture, the weight of memory. It pulled her under. Her hand moved, trembling to touch its head. But the fur was cold. Not cool like a winter dog's coat. Cold like stone left in shadow. Cold like earth. Her fingers recoiled. Her mind snapped out of its daze. Inside the house, the old radio in the kitchen, long unplugged and dead for years, crackled faintly, spilling static into the silence like a forgotten breath. The sound shouldn't have been possible. Nothing about this was possible. But it was happening. She stood abruptly, heart pounding, and the dog didn't follow. It only tilted its head again, this time slower, watching her retreat toward the door with the same mute attention as before. She fumbled with the doorknob, stepped back inside, and closed it with a sharp, final click. Her breath shuddered in her chest. Through the small glass pane she saw it still sitting there, waiting. The night passed in restless silence. Lena didn't sleep. She sat curled in her grandmother's chair, holding the old ceramic mug Buffy had once knocked over in a playful fit. Now it just felt like an artifact. Outside, the porch remained empty when she dared to check again just before dawn. No scorch marks, no paw prints, no trace. Only the faint smell of pine and frost. But her body knew. Something had been there, and it had not been a dream. The next day Imran didn't call. She didn't tell him what happened. What could she say? He'd fly back and call someone to check her in. He already believed she was unwell. Maybe she was, but she also remembered what she saw, what she felt, and what she didn't. That evening she walked out to the woods. She hadn't set foot beyond the tree line since the 3rd month after Buffy had vanished. She had searched every trail, every hollow, until her shoes were torn and her voice had broken from shouting. Now, she walked without calling his name. The dog had returned on its own. If it had a message, she needed to find the rest of it. About 100 yards in, just before the creek, she saw something new, a mound of earth, not fresh, not ancient, just disturbed. The moss around it hadn't yet grown back. On top of the mound sat a stone, not carved, not placed like a headstone, just chosen. There was fur caught beneath it, white, to clean. To have stayed untouched in this place for years, Lena knelt, not out of choice but gravity. She reached forward and gently touched the fur. The world tilted. She wasn't in the forest anymore. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. It felt like time had folded, like she had slipped into the thin place between one moment and another. There was no sound, no wind, only the feeling of being watched not by danger but by decision. And then she heard a voice not in her ears but in the hollow part of her that had never healed. A voice she had once believed was gone. You let go too soon. She blinked, hard. The forest returned. The mound was still there, but now the stone had moved, rolled to the side, and beneath it, a small carved figure had been revealed, wood-worn, shaped like a dog, curled in sleep. One she had carved herself long ago as a child. She had buried it with him, hadn't she, in a box? But not here, not in this place. Her hands shook as she lifted the figure. The detail was still there, the little notch she'd accidentally made with a knife. This was hers, and yet it wasn't. Behind her, a twig snapped. She turned, heart clenchying, at the edge of the clearing. The dog stood again, still watching, waiting, and this time its tail wagged, but not like Barfy's wagged. This was slower, heavier, like it wasn't happy to see her. Just ready. Ready for what? She didn't yet know, but she would. And soon. The porch boards didn't creak under Lena's weight, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the dog's return. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hands trembled at her sides, and somewhere beneath the decades of rationality and pain, something old and primal rose inside her. The dog stood there, neither advancing nor retreating, a figure carved from the memory of love and the distortion of time. Its chest rose slowly, breath by breath, as if the night air itself was feeding it. Lena could feel it. Something was off, the way its presence pulled at the light, the way the shadows seemed to lean toward it. There was no wag of a tail, no twitch of excitement, only stillness. It was a dog's shape, but not a dog's soul. Still, she whispered again, this time not calling him by name, but asking a question. Where have you been? Her voice cracked like dry leaves, lost in the breeze that carried no scent, no warmth. The dog blinked, once, slow, deliberate. She couldn't look away. It was like staring into a version of Barfy molded from ash and memory, without time, without decay. Yet every detail was precisely what it should be, down to the scar near his left eye, the one he got from chasing a squirrel into bramble. How could that be possible? Her fingers curled against her palm. She wanted to touch him, to feel warmth and bone beneath fur, to let her body confirm what her heart was screaming. But her feet wouldn't move. That paw print, this scorched one, remained black against the wood. She looked down at it again. Not fading, not evaporating, just burned into the grain like a brand. Her instincts whispered what her mind refused to say. Some things do not come back the same. Some doors, once opened, do not shut cleanly behind. The dog stepped forward again, now to pause on the porch. The air grew thinner, not colder but emptier, as though the space around him swallowed sound, warmth, and weight. Lena reached for the railing beside her. The metal felt warm, too warm for midnight. She withdrew her hand, blinking hard. The dog now stood just feet away. Still no bark, no sound. Just watching her with those impossible gray eyes that didn't reflect the porch light. Eyes that didn't seem to belong to the living. From behind the door, something creaked. Not inside the house, but within her. A door she had closed long ago. 5 years of dreams, prayers, therapy, and forgetting, all built on the assumption that death was final. But here he was, or something like him, and that meant everything she had healed from, everything she had buried, might not have stayed buried at all. A sound came then, not from the dog, but from the woods. A second set of paws, lighter, slower, careful. Lena turned her head sharply, heart now thrashing inside her chest. Another shape emerged from the tree line, smaller, fur-matted, limbs in one leg, and the eyes, those were the eyes she remembered. Hazel, familiar, honest. The smaller dog hesitated at the edge of the woods, then whimpered once, soft and uncertain. Lena's breath caught, her throat tightened. There were two of them now, one burned into memory, one worn by time, and suddenly, she understood the wrongness of it all. The creature on her porch, the perfect replicate, wasn't Barfy, it was something made of longing, something that had learned how to wear grief like a costume. Lena took a step back. Her hand went to her chest as if to protect her heart from cracking wide open. The real Barfy, if he'd survived, would have aged, would have struggled, would have bled. And this dog at the tree line had all of that written into its trembling frame. But it couldn't be. She had searched for months. She had waited, and nothing, so how now? The porch dog finally turned its head, slowly, toward the other one. There was no aggression in the gesture. No threat. just ... acknowledgement. And then, the wind blew again, strong this time, lifting the curtains inside the house, stirring the leaves at her feet, and the dog on the porch slowly stepped down, not toward Lena, but toward the trees, toward the second dog. The two didn't meet, didn't sniff or bark, just stood there in silence. Then the first one, the perfect one, turned again, and this time it walked away, not toward the road, not into the woods, but into the dark, between places, and as it moved, it faded, not suddenly, but gradually, like mist, dissolving into shadow. One step, then half a shape, then nothing. The second dog remained cautious, still limping, still alive. Lena's tears fell freely now, without sobs, without sound. She took a shaky step off the porch. The real one didn't run. It waited. And this time when she whispered his name, soft and trembling, it came not from desperation, but from knowing Barfi. And the dog, broken and true, limped toward her with all the weight of 5 lost years between them. Lena didn't rush. She let him come at his own pace. The limp was more pronounced up close, the fur grayer patchy in places, and his chest rose with the effort of each step. But when he reached her, there was no doubt this was Barfi, not a ghost, not a dream, stitched together by longing, just an old dog who had found his way back. She knelt carefully, her fingers hovering for a moment before she let them rest on his head. His fur was coarse, warm, real. She felt the slight tremor in his shoulders, the slow thump of his tail against her boot. For the first time in years, something in her chest exhaled. Not relief, not joy, just quiet release. They stayed like that, for a while, woman and dog, framed by a porch light that flickered as if unsure whether to burn or fade. There were questions, so many questions. Where had he been? How had he survived? Who had cared for him? But none of it mattered, not tonight, because sometimes the return is not about the road taken, but about what it means to come home at all. Lena stood slowly, guiding him gently with one hand beneath his chest. He stumbled once, then followed, into the house, past the cold kitchen, past the wall where his leash used to hang, into the small living room where his bed had once been, now replaced by a low bookshelf and an old plant that leaned toward the light. She cleared a space without thinking, placed a folded blanket on the floor, and watched as Barfi circled once, then curled in just like he always had. She sat beside him on the rug, knees pulled to her chest. No music, no distractions, just the rhythm of his breath and the soft hum of night. The house felt different now, not healed, but honest. Grief had once filled every room, staining the windows, dulling the colors. But now the silence wasn't empty, it was full. Of memory, of return, of something unfinished, now gently resolved. Outside, the wind shifted again, not sharp, but cleansing, the kind that carries the scent of pine and something older. Lena looked once more toward the trees, toward the place where the other dog, whatever it had been, had vanished. She didn't feel fear, just understanding. Some losses echo until they're answered. Some pain lingers until it's witnessed. Maybe that other presence had never meant harm. Maybe it had been grief itself, finally ready to let go. She reached down, stroking Barfi's side. He was already asleep, a soft wheeze escaping his muzzle with each breath. She could feel the years in his body, the distance he must have traveled, and the weight he carried home. And she knew he wouldn't be here for long, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had come back not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as himself, worn, tired, real. The clock ticked gently in the corner. No fanfare, no miracle, just the quiet sound of a promise kept.